June 19, 1944. German intelligence officers in Berlin read the American after-action reports with skepticism bordering on contempt. The new American carrier fighter, the F6F Hellcat, had just claimed 412 Japanese aircraft destroyed in a single day of combat during what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Luftwaffe veterans who had studied the specifications dismissed it as propaganda. The Hellcat was too heavy, too slow, lacking the agility that defined fighter supremacy. Yet, in 24 months of continuous combat, this supposedly inferior aircraft would claim a kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese forces and fundamentally rewrite the rules of carrier aviation. The story of how American engineering philosophy triumphed over German design elegance begins not in the Pacific skies, but in a Long Island factory where a team of engineers was building the most underestimated fighter of the Second World War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The wind off the Long Island Sound carried the smell of salt water and machine oil through the open doors of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation plant. Inside, rows of workers assembled the stubby, barrel-shaped fighters that would soon fill American carrier decks. The F4F Wildcat had proven itself in the early months of Pacific combat, but everyone at Grumman knew it was outmatched. Japanese Zeros could outclimb it, outturn it, and outrun it at altitude. American pilots were dying because their aircraft couldn't match enemy performance. Roy Grumman stood in the design office, reviewing blueprints for the aircraft that would replace the Wildcat. He was a practical man, an engineer who had founded his company in 1929 with $66,000 and a commitment to building aircraft that worked. Not aircraft that looked good on paper. Not aircraft that impressed at air shows. Aircraft that could take punishment, bring pilots home, and win fights. The philosophy was simple. Make it strong, make it reliable, make it effective. The design taking shape on those blueprints reflected that philosophy in every line. Project designation XF6F. The Navy had requested a carrier-based fighter that could defeat the Zero. Grumman's engineering team, led by Chief Engineer William Schwendler and Project Engineer Bob Hall, had studied every combat report from the Pacific. They had interviewed pilots who had survived encounters with Japanese fighters. They had analyzed wreckage of shot-down Zeros recovered by American forces. The conclusions were clear. The Zero dominated through superior maneuverability and climb rate. It achieved this through extreme lightness. No armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal armament. The Zero sacrificed everything for performance. It was a philosophy that produced a fighter of exceptional agility but fatal vulnerability. A few hits from American .50 caliber machine guns would tear it apart. Grumman took the opposite approach. The XF6F would be built around pilot protection and firepower. Heavy armor plating behind the pilot's seat, bulletproof glass in the windscreen, self-sealing fuel tanks that could take hits without exploding. 6 .50 caliber machine guns, more firepower than any carrier fighter in service. The weight penalty was enormous. The XF6F would weigh over 12,000 pounds fully loaded, nearly double the Zero's weight. Critics within the Navy questioned whether such a heavy fighter could operate from carriers. The design seemed to violate every principle of carrier aviation. Light was better, maneuverable was essential. The Zero had proven that. But Grumman's engineers calculated differently. They weren't trying to build an aircraft that could dogfight with the Zero. They were building an aircraft that could kill Zeros while keeping American pilots alive. The prototype first flew on June 26, 1942. Test pilot. Robert L. Hall advanced the throttle of the Pratt & Whitney R2000 800 double Wasp engine. The massive 18-cylinder radial engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly triple the Wildcat's power. The aircraft accelerated down the runway at Bethpage and lifted off smoothly. Hall climbed to 10,000 feet and began putting the fighter through its paces. The XF6F handled differently than the Wildcat. Heavier, more stable, less twitchy. The controls required more force, but the responses were predictable. Visibility was excellent. The pilot sat high in the fuselage with the massive engine cowling sloping away below. The view forward and to the sides was unobstructed. Below, the view was blocked by the wide wings, but in combat, threats came from above and behind, not below. Hall pushed the aircraft into a dive. The speed built rapidly. 300 miles per hour, 350, 380. The aircraft remained stable and controllable. The Wildcat would have buffeted and shaken. The XF6F tracked straight and true. He pulled back on the stick, bringing the nose up. The G-forces pressed him into his seat as the fighter arced upward. No structural complaints, no alarming sounds, just solid, predictable performance. Back on the ground, Hall's report was positive. The aircraft flew well. It was fast, stable, and strong. But it wasn't exceptional. The speed was good, but not outstanding. The climb rate was adequate, but nothing special. The maneuverability was acceptable for a fighter this size, but the Zero could still turn inside it. On paper, the XF6F looked like a compromise. Not bad, but not great. German intelligence officers, receiving reports through neutral channels about American aircraft development, assessed the XF6F with professional skepticism. Luftwaffe analysts in Berlin compiled specifications and compared them to German fighters and known Japanese aircraft. The conclusions were uniformly negative. Maximum speed, 376 miles per hour at 23,400 feet. The Focke-Wulf Fu 190 could exceed 400 miles per hour. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G could match the Hellcat's speed. Even the Zero, with less powerful engines, could nearly match it at certain altitudes. Speed advantage, minimal at best. Rate of climb, 3,410 feet per minute. German fighters climbed faster. The Fu 190 could manage 3,900 feet per minute. The Bf 109G could exceed 4,000 feet per minute. The Hellcat would lose the climb to altitude, arriving late to intercept bombers or gain position over enemy fighters. Climb rate, inferior to contemporary fighters. Wing loading, 35 pounds per square foot. High wing loading meant reduced maneuverability. The Zero's wing loading was under 20 pounds per square foot. Japanese fighters would turn inside the Hellcat every time. German fighters, while heavier than the Zero, still had better power-to-weight ratios. Maneuverability, significantly inferior to primary opponents. Weight, 12,186 pounds empty, 15,413 pounds maximum takeoff. The aircraft was a truck compared to fighters designed for agility. Every pound reduced acceleration, climb rate, and turning performance. The Hellcat carried the weight penalty of armor and fuel tank protection. Weight, excessive compared to high-performance fighters. The assessment was damning. The F6F appeared to be another example of American industrial brute force trying to compensate for inferior design. Heavy engine producing massive horsepower to overcome excessive weight, thick armor to protect pilots who lacked the skill to avoid being hit. 6 machine guns because American pilots couldn't shoot accurately. The aircraft embodied everything German fighter philosophy rejected. German fighter design emphasized performance through engineering elegance. Lightweight, powerful engines, precise handling. Pilots trained to exceptional skill levels could maximize the potential of high-performance machines. The Luftwaffe had proven this approach from Spain through the Battle of Britain to the Eastern Front. German fighters dominated through superior performance and pilot quality. The Hellcat represented the opposite philosophy. Make the aircraft survivable rather than supremely maneuverable. Give pilots tools to compensate for skill differences. Build in margins for error. Accept performance compromises in exchange for operational advantages. To German eyes, this was admission of inferiority. American pilots needed protection because they couldn't match German or Japanese pilot skill. Reports circulated through Luftwaffe fighter units describing the American aircraft. Experienced pilots read the specifications and laughed. Some openly mocked the design. Heavy, slow, clumsy. The Hellcat was a flying tank that would be easy prey for properly handled fighters. American industrial capacity could build thousands of them, but quantity couldn't overcome fundamental design inferiority. The assessments were shared with Japanese counterparts through diplomatic channels. Japanese naval aviation officers studied the Hellcat specifications with similar conclusions. Their analysis focused on comparison with the Zero, the fighter that had dominated Pacific skies since December 1941. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was a masterpiece of lightweight design, empty weight under 4,000 pounds, maximum speed 331 miles per hour, rate of climb 4,517 feet per minute, range over 1,900 miles. The Zero could outmaneuver anything in the sky. Against this standard, the Hellcat appeared hopelessly outclassed. Japanese pilots had already proven they could defeat the heavier, less maneuverable F4F Wildcat. The Hellcat was just a bigger, heavier Wildcat, more of the same failed American approach. Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized maneuverability combat. Pilots trained extensively in dogfighting techniques. The Zero's superior turning ability meant Japanese pilots could force opponents into turning fights and destroy them. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant tactical aviation minds, reviewed intelligence reports on the Hellcat with professional interest but little concern. The American aircraft represented incremental improvement, not revolutionary change. It would be faster than the Wildcat in level flight and diving, certainly. The armor protection would make it harder to shoot down. But in the maneuvering combat that decided air battles, the Zero would retain its superiority. What German and Japanese analysts failed to appreciate was that Grumman wasn't trying to build a better dogfighter. They were building a weapons system optimized for a completely different kind of warfare. The Hellcat's design reflected lessons from 2 years of Pacific combat that German and Japanese intelligence hadn't fully grasped. The Zero's dominance came from forcing American fighters into the kind of combat where the Zero's advantages mattered most: low-speed turning fights at medium altitudes. American pilots, flying inferior aircraft, had no choice but to accept these engagements. They lost consistently, but analysis of successful engagements revealed a different pattern. When American pilots could dictate the terms of combat, when they could use altitude advantage and diving speed, the heavier American fighters could win. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thash, flying F4F Wildcats from USS Yorktown, had developed tactics that exploited the Wildcats' advantages while negating the Zero's maneuverability edge. The Thach weave used pairs of fighters in mutual support. When a Zero latched onto one Wildcat's tail, his wingman would turn toward the attack, forcing the Zero to either break off or face a head-on pass. The tactic worked because it used the Wildcat's straight-line speed and heavy armament rather than trying to turn with the Zero. Grumman studied these tactics during the Hellcat's design phase. The aircraft's characteristics were optimized for exactly this kind of combat: superior diving speed to execute boom and zoom attacks, heavy firepower to inflict damage in brief firing, opportunities, armor protection to survive when attacks didn't go perfectly, excellent visibility to maintain situational awareness. The Hellcat was designed to fight the way American pilots were learning to fight, not the way German or Japanese doctrine said fighters should fight. By December 1942, production F6F Hellcats were rolling off the Grumman production line at an increasing rate. The Navy accepted the first operational aircraft in January 1943. Squadron assignments began immediately. VF-9 aboard USS Essex would be the first squadron to take the Hellcat into combat. Pilots transitioning from Wildcats found the Hellcat forgiving and confidence-inspiring. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrasiu, who would become one of the Navy's top aces, flew his first Hellcat in early 1943. His initial impression was positive but not enthusiastic. The aircraft was solid, dependable, and comfortable. It wasn't exciting like the stories about German fighters or the legendary agility of Japanese Zeros. It was just a very good aircraft that did everything well without being exceptional at anything. This was exactly what Grumman had designed. Not a thoroughbred racing aircraft that required exceptional skill to fly at the edge of performance. A robust, reliable fighter that good pilots could fly effectively and average pilots could fly competently. The performance envelope was broad and forgiving. The aircraft was hard to stall, recovered easily from spins, and remained controllable even when damaged. The massive engine provided power reserves for every situation. Training accidents were remarkably low compared to high-performance fighters. Pilots could focus on learning tactics and gunnery rather than struggling to master difficult flight characteristics. The wide landing gear track made carrier landings easier. The excellent visibility made formation flying less stressful. The reliable R2800 engine meant fewer mechanical failures. Everything about the Hellcat made it easier for pilots to concentrate on fighting rather than flying. German intelligence continued receiving reports about Hellcat deployments. The assessments remained unchanged. A competent but unexceptional aircraft. American industrial capacity would produce them in large numbers, but numbers alone wouldn't determine air superiority. Quality mattered more than quantity. The Luftwaffe had proven this over Europe repeatedly. Well-trained pilots in high-performance fighters could defeat numerically superior but inferior opponents. The first combat deployment of the Hellcat came on August 31, 1943, during Operation Cartwheel, the Allied campaign to isolate the Japanese base at Rabaul. VF-5 and VF-9, flying from USS Essex and USS Yorktown, encountered Japanese aircraft over Marcus Island. The Americans had altitude advantage and dove on the Japanese formation. The engagement lasted minutes. The Hellcats used speed and firepower, diving through the Japanese formation, firing bursts, and climbing away before the lighter Japanese fighters could respond effectively. The results shocked Japanese commanders. 4 Japanese aircraft destroyed, no American losses. The pattern repeated in subsequent engagements. Japanese pilots tried to force the Hellcats into turning fights where zero superiority would matter. American pilots refused. They maintained speed and altitude advantage, attacking from above, using diving passes, and avoiding prolonged maneuvering combat. When Japanese fighters tried to climb after them, the Hellcat's superior power-to-weight ratio at high speeds meant they could outrun pursuit. Reports reached German analysts describing these engagements. The assessments began shifting. The Hellcat was performing better than specifications suggested. American pilots were applying disciplined tactics that exploited their aircraft's strengths, but German observers attributed this to numerical superiority and Japanese pilot quality degradation. As the war progressed, Japan's best pilots were being killed. Replacement pilots had less training and experience. The Hellcat was succeeding against increasingly inferior opposition. This analysis was partially correct but missed the fundamental point. The Hellcat wasn't succeeding despite its design compromises. It was succeeding because of them. The armor protection meant pilots survived encounters that would have killed them in lighter fighters. They lived to apply lessons learned, to refine tactics, to become more experienced. The stable flight characteristics meant pilots could focus on tactical decisions rather than fighting their aircraft. The heavy armament meant brief firing opportunities could be decisive. By early 1944, Hellcat production had ramped to full capacity. Grumman's Bethpage plant was producing over 500 aircraft per month. A new plant in Trenton, New Jersey, added additional capacity. The Navy was receiving Hellcats faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. Carrier air groups were completely re-equipped. The F4F Wildcat was relegated to escort carrier duties. The Hellcat became the standard U.S. Navy carrier fighter. In Berlin, German intelligence compiled comprehensive assessments of American naval aviation capabilities for the spring of 1944. The reports acknowledged that American carrier forces had achieved local air superiority in several Pacific campaigns. This was attributed to overwhelming numerical advantage. 15 American fleet carriers were operational compared to Japan's reduced carrier forces after losses at Midway and subsequent battles. The mathematics were simple. More carriers meant more aircraft, meant local superiority. The Hellcat itself still didn't impress German analysts. Yes, it was effective in numbers, but individual performance remained unexceptional. The real measure would come when Hellcats faced first-line opposition in decisive combat. That test was approaching. Japanese naval aviation was preparing a counterstroke to halt the American advance across the Pacific. The Japanese combined fleet, though reduced, still operated formidable carrier air groups. The upcoming battle would determine whether the Hellcat was genuinely superior or merely adequate aircraft succeeding through numerical advantage. What neither German nor Japanese intelligence fully appreciated was the comprehensive system the U.S. Navy had built around the Hellcat. The aircraft was just one component. Pilot training had been revolutionized. New tactics were being taught systematically. Radar-directed fighter control from carriers allowed coordinated interceptions. Intelligence from code-breaking provided warning of Japanese movements. The Hellcat operated within an integrated system that maximized its effectiveness while minimizing its limitations. The German criticism of American fighters as brute force engineering missed the sophistication of American operational methods. The Hellcat wasn't designed to be the best fighter in one-on-one combat. It was designed to be the most effective fighter within a system of carrier operations, radar control, and coordinated tactics. Performance specifications told only part of the story. Operational effectiveness told the complete story. By June 1944, the stage was set for the decisive test. American forces were preparing to invade the Mariana Islands, bringing them within bombing range of the Japanese home islands. Japan's naval leadership recognized this as the critical battle. Operation Eigo was planned as the counterstroke that would halt the American advance. The Japanese combined fleet would sortie in strength. Carrier air groups, though reduced from their pre-war peak, still numbered over 400 aircraft. The coming battle would decide command of the Pacific. In Berlin, intelligence officers tracking Pacific operations predicted a Japanese victory if the forces met on relatively equal terms. Japanese pilot quality, though reduced, remained superior to American training standards. Japanese aircraft, particularly the Zero, retained performance advantages in the maneuvering combat that characterized carrier battles. The Americans had numbers, but the Japanese had quality. The Hellcat was about to face its ultimate test. The verdict would come not from specifications on paper, but from combat in the skies over the Philippine Sea. German fighter pilots, reading intelligence summaries, remained confident in their assessments. The Hellcat was a workmanlike aircraft, nothing more. It would perform adequately in the hands of adequate pilots supported by overwhelming numbers, but it would never achieve the kind of decisive combat results that marked truly superior fighters. That judgment was about to be proven catastrophically wrong in what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the single most lopsided air battle in naval history. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lieutenant, junior grade, Alexander Vrasiu squinted through his oil-smeared windscreen at the formation ahead. His F6F Hellcat supercharger had malfunctioned during the climb, forcing him to lag behind his division. Now, at 20,000 feet, he found himself alone, watching what looked like a swarm of dark insects against the brilliant blue of the Philippine Sea sky. The radio crackled with frantic transmissions. Japanese aircraft were inbound to Task Force 58 inches, massive numbers. This was the decisive moment everyone had anticipated. Operation Eigo, Japan's counterstroke to halt the American advance into the Marianas, had begun. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had launched his entire available air strength, over 370 aircraft, in coordinated strikes designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. Vrasiu pushed his throttle forward despite the struggling supercharger. The Hellcat accelerated, its massive R2800 engine roaring at maximum power. Below, the formation became clearer. Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, at least 50 of them, heading directly toward the American carriers. They flew in neat three-plane V formations, disciplined and purposeful. These weren't the experienced veterans who had struck Pearl Harbor or devastated Force Z off Malaya. Those men were dead, casualties of Midway, Coral Sea, and 2 years of attrition over the Solomons. These were replacement pilots, average training time reduced from 2 years to 6 months. The Japanese formation maintained strict radio silence, unaware that American radar had detected them over an hour earlier. Radar-directed fighter controllers aboard the carriers had vectored dozens of Hellcats to intercept positions. The Japanese pilots flew into a carefully prepared ambush, their formations tracked and plotted with precision impossible in earlier battles. Vratsu dove on the formation from above and behind, exactly as tactical doctrine prescribed. No maneuvering fight, no prolonged engagement. A single high-speed pass using altitude and surprise. The first Judy filled his gun sight. Range 200 feet. He pressed the trigger. All 6. 50 caliber machine guns fired in a synchronized burst. Tracers streamed forward. The Judy's fragile structure disintegrated under the concentrated firepower. No armor plating protected the pilot. No self-sealing tanks prevented fuel ignition. The aircraft exploded, debris tumbling toward the sea 20,000 feet below. Vratsu didn't pause to watch. His training emphasized economy of ammunition and rapid target acquisition. He swung onto the second Judy, fired a 2-second burst, and watched it catch fire. The pilot attempted to bail out but was too low. The burning aircraft spiraled into the ocean. 2 kills in 30 seconds. Vratsu's oil-covered windscreen made aiming difficult, but his gunnery instructor's voice echoed in memory. Trust your instruments, lead the target, short bursts. The formation fragmented as Japanese pilots realized. They were under attack. Some attempted defensive maneuvers. Others pressed forward toward their targets, committed to completing their mission despite losses mounting around them. Vratsu pursued a pair of Judy's banking left. He closed on the trailing aircraft, fired, and watched it explode. Debris peppered his Hellcat's wings. Small punctures appeared in the fabric-covered control surfaces, but the damage was minor. The second Judy tried to dive away. Vratsu followed, his Hellcat's superior diving speed allowing him to overhaul the lighter Japanese bomber. Another burst. The 4th kill. 8 minutes had elapsed since the engagement began. Vratsu had fired 360 rounds from his 2,400-round ammunition load. His fuel gauge showed adequate reserves, but the carriers below were beginning anti-aircraft fire. The sky around him filled with black puffs of exploding shells. American gunners couldn't distinguish friend from foe in the chaos. Any aircraft within range became a target. 3 more Judys appeared ahead, beginning their final approach to bombing runs on American destroyers. Vratsu closed rapidly. He destroyed one at 400 feet altitude, so low that his Hellcat shuddered from the explosion's concussion. The next Judy was entering its dive when Vratsu's guns found it. The aircraft disintegrated, its bomb falling harmlessly into the sea. The 6th Judy flew directly into the American flak zone. Vratsu followed, shouting into his radio that he was friendly. Gunners aboard USS Lexington nearly shot him down before recognizing the Hellcat's distinctive profile. He landed aboard Lexington 10 minutes later, taxied forward, and shut down his engine. The deck crew swarmed his aircraft, examining battle damage and checking ammunition expenditure. Vratsu climbed from the cockpit, exhausted but exhilarated. As he walked across the deck toward the island structure, he caught sight of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher on the bridge. The diminutive admiral, wearing his characteristic lobsterman's cap, watched the recovery operations. Vratsu smiled broadly and held up 6 fingers. 6 kills. 8 minutes. A Navy photographer captured the moment. The image would become iconic, symbolizing American air superiority in the Pacific. What Vrasyu had experienced was occurring across the entire task force. Fighter directors aboard 15 American carriers had created an integrated air defense network unprecedented in naval warfare. Radar tracked incoming raids from over 150 miles. Controllers calculated intercept vectors and directed fighter divisions to optimal positions. The Japanese attacks, though numerically impressive, arrived in uncoordinated waves that American defenses systematically destroyed. The first Japanese strike, launched at 8:30 a.m., comprised 69 aircraft. Fighter controllers vectored 50 Hellcats to intercept them 50 miles from the fleet. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. 42 Japanese aircraft were shot down. Not a single bomb hit an American ship. Japanese carriers attempted to recover them, but mechanical failures and pilot inexperience resulted in numerous landing accidents. Aircraft crashed on flight decks, blocking operations and forcing others to ditch. The second strike consisted of 128 aircraft, the largest coordinated formation Japan could launch. American radar detected them at 11 a.m. Fighter controllers scrambled additional Hellcats and repositioned combat air patrols to create multiple interception layers. The Japanese formation flew into a gauntlet. The first interception occurred 60 miles from the fleet. Hellcats tore through the formation using boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude, firing brief bursts, and climbing away before Japanese fighters could respond. The lighter Zeros couldn't match the Hellcats' diving speed or climbing power at high speeds. When they tried to turn fight, Hellcats simply disengaged and repositioned. Over 100 Japanese aircraft were destroyed during the second strike. Those that penetrated to the fleet faced intense anti-aircraft fire from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The new VT proximity-fused shells, which exploded when near aircraft rather than requiring direct hits, proved devastatingly effective. Japanese pilots, already stressed by the fighter gauntlet, faced a wall of exploding steel. Most never reached bombing positions. Those that did found their accuracy degraded by evasive maneuvering and the psychological pressure of continuous combat. The third and fourth Japanese strikes arrived in the afternoon. Each met the same fate: radar detection, fighter interception, anti-aircraft fire. By 3 p.m., the battle's outcome was clear. Japan had launched 373 carrier aircraft, only 130 returned, and many of those were too damaged for further operations. American losses: 23 Hellcats in aerial combat. The kill ratio exceeded 16-1. Pilots returned to their carriers, describing targets so numerous that shooting them down was compared to hunting turkeys. Commander Paul Buey coined the phrase that would define the battle, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the statistics only told part of the story. The Hellcats' performance validated every design decision Grumman had made. The armor protection meant pilots survived hits that would have killed them in lighter fighters. Lieutenant, junior grade, William E. Henry took a 20mm cannon hit to his engine cowling. The shell penetrated but failed to reach the pilot's compartment, stopped by armor plating. Henry flew his damaged Hellcat back to the carrier and landed safely. In a Zero, that hit would have been fatal. The self-sealing fuel tanks proved their worth repeatedly. Dozens of Hellcats took bullet strikes to fuel cells. The rubber inner lining swelled when exposed to fuel, automatically sealing small holes. Pilots reported fuel gauge readings dropping but stabilizing, allowing them to return to their carriers. Japanese aircraft lacked this technology. Any fuel tank puncture meant fire, explosion, or forced landing. The vulnerability was not theoretical but proven in combat hundreds of times during this single day. The heavy armament, criticized by German analysts as compensation for poor marksmanship, demonstrated its tactical value. Hellcat pilots didn't need prolonged firing opportunities. Brief 2-second bursts delivered sufficient firepower to destroy targets. The 6.50 caliber machine guns fired a combined 4,800 rounds per minute. At typical combat ranges of 200 to 400 feet, that firepower concentration was overwhelming. Japanese aircraft structures couldn't absorb it. Vrasyu's 6 kills using only 360 rounds illustrated the efficiency. Skilled pilots maximized the heavy armament through precise gunnery, not ammunition wastage. The stable flight characteristics allowed pilots to concentrate on tactical decisions rather than aircraft control. In the chaotic environment of multiplane engagements, with aircraft diving, climbing, and maneuvering in 3 dimensions, pilots needed aircraft that responded predictably. The Hellcat's forgiving nature meant average pilots could fly it effectively in combat. Inexperienced pilots made fewer mistakes. The aircraft compensated for judgment errors that would prove fatal in high-performance but unforgiving fighters. As the afternoon progressed, American reconnaissance aircraft located the Japanese fleet 275 miles west of the American task force. Admiral Spruance faced a critical decision: pursue and attack the retreating Japanese carriers, or maintain defensive positions protecting the invasion forces at Saipan. The aggressive option risked night carrier operations, notoriously dangerous even under ideal conditions. The defensive option guaranteed the invasion's success, but allowed the Japanese fleet to escape. Spruance chose to maintain position. The decision frustrated carrier commanders who wanted to pursue and destroy the Japanese carriers completely. But Spruance's primary mission was protecting the Saipan landings. He had accomplished that decisively. The Japanese air groups were destroyed. Without aircraft, the carriers were useless. The strategic objective was achieved without risking a night engagement that could result in American losses. The next day brought vindication for the pursuit advocates. American search planes relocated the Japanese fleet at dawn. Admiral Mitcher launched a maximum effort strike at extreme range. Over 200 aircraft, Hellcats, dive bombers, and torpedo planes flew 300 miles to attack. The strike arrived at dusk. In the fading light, American pilots sank the carrier Hio and damaged 2 others. But the return flight became a nightmare. Pilots flew back in darkness, their fuel gauges approaching empty. Navigation was by dead reckoning across featureless ocean. Some aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched. Pilots radioed their positions, inflated life rafts, and waited for rescue. Others found the task force but crashed attempting night landings on carrier decks. Admiral Mitcher made the unprecedented decision to illuminate the entire fleet. Searchlights snapped on. Signal lights blazed. The task force became a beacon visible for miles, risking submarine attack to guide aircraft home. Lieutenant Junior Grade Vrasyu found himself escorting a damaged TBM Avenger torpedo bomber back to the fleet. The Avenger's hydraulics were shot out, landing gear jammed halfway extended. The pilot, wounded and disoriented, needed guidance. Vrasyu talked him through the approach, maintaining position on the Avenger's wing, providing verbal instructions over the radio. The Avenger landed hard but safely. Vrasyu landed immediately after, completing what pilots called the mission beyond darkness. The 2-day battle permanently crippled Japanese naval aviation. The carriers survived, but without trained aircrews, they were hollow shells. Japan could build aircraft, but replacing trained pilots proved impossible. Training programs couldn't produce competent aircrews in the time available. The few experienced pilots remaining were hoarded for defensive operations, not offensive strikes. The Imperial Japanese Navy never again attempted a major carrier operation. German intelligence officers in Berlin received reports of the battle within days. The initial reaction was disbelief. The numbers seemed impossible. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed in 2 days for minimal American losses. Either the reports were propaganda, or something fundamental had changed in Pacific air combat. Further investigation revealed the truth. The Hellcat, dismissed as an adequate but unexceptional aircraft, had proven devastatingly effective in the hands of well-trained pilots operating within an integrated system. The German assessment had been fundamentally flawed. Luftwaffe analysts had evaluated the Hellcat as an individual fighter, comparing its specifications to German and Japanese aircraft in theoretical combat. But the Hellcat was never intended to be a superior dogfighter. It was designed as a component in a larger weapons system that included radar detection, fighter direction, coordinated tactics, and comprehensive pilot training. Specifications couldn't capture the effectiveness of that integrated approach. The armor protection, criticized as excessive weight, provided strategic value beyond individual survivability. Pilots who survived combat gained experience. Experienced pilots flew more effectively. Effectiveness created more survivors. The cycle compounded over time. American pilot quality increased while Japanese quality decreased. By June 1944, the experience gap was enormous. Average American carrier pilots had 300 hours of flight training before combat deployment. Japanese replacement pilots had 100 hours or less. The tactical doctrine, developed through 2 years of Pacific combat experience, exploited American advantages while negating Japanese strengths. American pilots refused turning engagements where zero maneuverability mattered. They fought using speed, altitude, and coordinated attacks where Hellcat performance advantages were decisive. Japanese pilots, trained in maneuver combat doctrine, couldn't adapt. Their tactics, proven effective in 1941 to 1942, were obsolete against disciplined opponents using modern methods. The radar-directed fighter control system represented innovation the Germans hadn't anticipated. Luftwaffe fighters operated under ground control in European theater, but carrier-based systems were far more sophisticated. American carriers essentially created mobile command centers that could direct air battles across hundreds of square miles. Japanese carriers lacked comparable systems. Their fighters launched and fought individually or in small groups, without central coordination. The organizational advantage was as significant as technological superiority. By July 1944, the strategic implications became clear. American forces secured Saipan despite desperate Japanese resistance. Construction crews immediately began building airfields for B-29 Superfortress bombers. Within months, American bombers launched from Saipan would reach Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and other Japanese cities. The Marianas became the launching point for the strategic bombing campaign that would devastate Japan's industrial capacity and civilian population. The Hellcat continued its dominance through the remainder of the Pacific War. During the liberation of the Philippines in October 1944, Hellcats provided air cover for the invasion forces. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, Hellcats flew combat air patrol missions that destroyed the few remaining Japanese carrier aircraft. When Japan resorted to kamikaze tactics in desperation, Hellcats defended the fleet, shooting down suicide aircraft before they could reach their targets. Commander David McCampbell, flying F6F Hellcats with Air Group 15, became the Navy's highest-scoring ace. On October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, McCampbell and his wingman encountered a formation of over 60 Japanese aircraft. In a running battle lasting 90 minutes, McCampbell personally shot down 9 aircraft, tying the American single-mission record. He ended the war with 34 confirmed kills, all achieved in Hellcats. His success epitomized the aircraft's capability in skilled hands. Production continued at maximum capacity. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, Grumman had built 12,275 F6F Hellcats. The production rate peaked at over 500 aircraft per month. One aircraft completed every 50 minutes around the clock. The efficiency of manufacturing matched the efficiency of combat operations. Simple construction meant fewer man-hours per aircraft. Standardized components simplified maintenance. The entire supply chain, from raw materials to operational deployment, functioned with precision that German industry, disrupted by strategic bombing, could never match in the war's final years. The final statistics were overwhelming. Hellcats were credited with destroying 5,156 enemy aircraft, representing 75% of all U.S. Navy aerial victories in the Pacific. The overall kill-to-loss ratio was 19 to 1 in aerial combat. Only 270 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat against all Japanese aircraft types throughout the entire war. The numbers validated Grumman's design philosophy completely. In Berlin, as Germany faced defeat in spring 1945, Luftwaffe analysts compiled final assessments of Allied aircraft. The section on the F6F Hellcat acknowledged that initial evaluations had been incorrect. The aircraft's effectiveness came not from superior individual performance, but from optimal design for its operational environment. Heavy armor, stable handling, reliable engine, and heavy armament proved more valuable in carrier operations than maximum speed or maneuverability. The lesson was noted but came too late to influence German aircraft development. Japanese naval officers, interviewed after the war, consistently cited American pilot quality and tactical superiority as the decisive factors in their defeat. But they acknowledged the Hellcat's role. The aircraft's robustness and firepower made American tactical advantages effective. A fragile, lightly armed fighter couldn't execute boom and zoom tactics successfully. The Hellcat's characteristics enabled the tactics that destroyed Japanese air power. The broader lesson extended beyond aviation. The Hellcat's success demonstrated that engineering for operational effectiveness differs from engineering for theoretical performance. Specifications measured in laboratories don't predict combat results. The integration of technology, training, tactics, and operational systems determines outcomes. The Hellcat was optimized for the complete system, not isolated performance metrics. German fighter design philosophy emphasized aircraft performance, seeking maximum speed, climb rate, and maneuverability. This approach produced excellent fighters like the Fave 190 and late-model Bf 109 seconds, but it also produced aircraft that required exceptional pilot skill, extensive maintenance, and operated poorly when damaged. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet rocket fighter exemplified the philosophy taken to extremes: phenomenal performance, impossible operational requirements, minimal combat effectiveness. American design philosophy prioritized operational requirements first, accepting performance compromises when necessary. The Hellcat represented this approach perfectly: not the fastest fighter, not the most maneuverable, not the longest range or highest altitude, but the most effective when all factors were considered: pilot survivability, ease of maintenance, reliability, production efficiency, compatibility with carrier operations, and lethality in the tactical environment where it would actually fight. For the men who flew the Hellcat, the aircraft became more than a weapons system. It was the tool that kept them alive while they completed the most dangerous missions imaginable. They trusted it completely. That trust was earned through countless combat missions where the Hellcat's characteristics proved themselves under fire. When Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vratsiu returned to his squadron in January 1945 after 5 weeks with Filipino guerrillas, having been shot down by ground fire, his first question was whether he could fly Hellcats again. The answer represented validation from the men who knew the aircraft best. By September 2, 1945, when Japan signed the surrender documents aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the war was over. Aircraft carriers of the Fast Carrier Task Force that had destroyed Japanese naval aviation stood at anchor in the bay. Their decks were crowded with Hellcats, the fighters that had made victory possible. The German pilots who had laughed at the Hellcat's specifications in 1943 were dead, prisoners, or contemplating defeat. The Japanese pilots who had trusted the Zero's superiority were gone, casualties of a battle they couldn't win. The Hellcat had proven that careful engineering, focused on solving real operational problems rather than maximizing performance statistics, could create weapons of devastating effectiveness. It demonstrated that the integration of technology, training, tactics, and operational systems mattered more than any single component. It showed that protection, reliability, and maintainability could be more valuable than raw performance. These lessons remain relevant 8 decades later in any field where complex systems must perform under demanding conditions. The story of how 412 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky on a single day in June 1944 is not primarily the story of a fighter aircraft. It is the story of men who flew that aircraft with extraordinary skill and courage. But it is also the story of engineers who designed for operational effectiveness, trainers who prepared pilots thoroughly, tacticians who developed methods optimized for American strengths, and commanders who integrated everything into a system that functioned with devastating precision. The Hellcat was the instrument. The victory belonged to the system and the men who made it work. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.